Hey everyone, welcome back to Blood, Guts, and Social Commentary. Another installment of the Satanic Panic series. We're going to look at the 90s. We're going to start appropriately in 1990 with In the Name of Satan. This is a preacher who is essentially just giving a sermon about the dangers Satanism poses to America. It's spliced in with a lot of interview material with victims of satanic ritual abuse, which I will get to a lot more in depth later, and just true experiences in satanic cults, as they put it. They make a point saying high school students are forming satanic cults. My guess is that that is a not-so-thinly veiled reference to Ricky Casso. They have quotes supposedly from the LAPD saying satanic groups make gangs look like nursery school, because when you break down the way most of these people talk about cults, they sound like they form almost in the same way gangs would, of they go and look for troubled youths to try and bring in, because it's slightly easier to manipulate them, and if they already have a strained relationship with their parents, getting them to disobey probably isn't that complicated. This is why any program that kind of talks about how to get out of or prevent a kid going into Satanism, essentially all they say on those lists is talk to your kids, know what's going on, basically be an attentive parent, which you'd think most people would kind of already know that, and you don't really need to disguise it as this is how you keep your kid out of Satanism. It's just, hey, this is how to keep your kid safe and out of trouble, is just be there and know what's going on. They then go on to laundry list serial killers that have referenced Satanism somewhere in their crimes. The big one most of them will hold up now is Ramirez. Richard Ramirez was a serial killer. He was also known as the Night Stalker. Well, he was the second person to technically be called the Night Stalker. He is by far the more prevalent one. He did inverted pentagrams on his palm during the trial. He did ask one of his victims while he was raping her to talk about Satan, say she loved Satan, and things like that. So he at least was playing at the idea of Satanism, like we talked in the last episode. Just because somebody says they're a Satanist or says they pledge allegiance to Satan doesn't necessarily a Satanist make, just like any other religion. A bunch of people, mostly women, come forward saying that they were victims of satanic ritual abuse. The stories are always pretty much about the same, and that's why this idea got so widespread, is almost all of them have some element of drinking and eating human waste and some element of cannibalism, where you either ate flesh or you watched other people eat flesh, and always there's a murder. They also go into talking about how Satanists are trying to recruit in daycares, and they list off a bunch of people who have been busted doing horrible, terrible things in daycares. The problem is, when you really looked at these people, either they had some kind of religious affiliation or it was secular. So it's one of those, it's hard to see where that fits in, because unfortunately it sounds like by the numbers child abuse. They do introduce another supposedly satanically induced crime of Tommy Sullivan was 14 years old. He killed his mother with a Boy Scout knife and then set a fire in the living room while his father and brother slept. Luckily, the smoke alarms worked and went off, waking his father. He put out the fire, so they came out scot-free. They were fine. But Tommy later took his own life with the same knife that he killed his mother with. Supposedly this was done via or for some kind of satanic influence. Next up is also in 1990, Satanic Cults and Ritual Crime. This video was supposedly produced for the Louisiana State Police, training them on how to deal with satanic cults in the area. They claim 9,000 kids go missing, just missing. They don't know what happened to them. And they believe 50% are linked to Satanism. This is where we start getting the baby farming claims that I referenced in the first episode. A lot of these people swear up and down that they kidnap children to sacrifice for Satan, or that women become pregnant within the cult. They give birth within the cult, so they don't have to go to the hospital. There's no record of this kid existing. just to sacrifice them. The logic in that tends to be childbearing is the greatest gift God could give a woman, and by birthing a child and destroying it, that is the ultimate slap in the face to God. They also talk again about how teens are really good prey. Their logic here is that teens are developing their personality, they're developing their sexuality, and they're rather impatient. This all always supposedly starts with either metal, video games, which video games are new in this one, or D&D, which has been the battle cry pretty much throughout this entire thing. They also give a list of supposed cult behavior, and it goes trespassing, vandalism, burglary, animal mutilations, traffic and selling of drugs, kidnapping, child abuse of physical, mental, or sexual nature, rape, and murder. That is a massive jump from like trespassing and vandalism. A lot of people can say they probably have some experience from that in their rebellious teen years. Burglary, kind of pushing it. Then you're talking about drugs and raping and murdering people. That's a hell of a jump. No pun intended. There's a reason that's killing animals is one of the big three in the kind of criteria most people hold to this person might become a serial killer one day. It's head injury, bedwetting past a normal age, and animal torture and killing. They do talk about satanic graffiti. A lot of it's pretty obvious, but the ones that are kind of weird are, they talk about the swastika, which most people are of the belief that Hitler had a preoccupation with the occult. So I get where they're coming in with that, even though cult and Satanism aren't necessarily tied. They also say AC/DC is a satanic bit of graffiti because it stands for Antichrist Devil Child. Weird, because the story I always heard was they got it off one of their sister's sewing machines because AC and D currents. Anyway, this video is also where we get a list of the levels of involvement, and this gets parroted all throughout the 90s. The first level is fun and games, which is like some interest in D&D and maybe you're listening to a bit of metal. Dabblers start to show serious interest. The warning signs for a dabbler are bitter attitude towards religion and family, decline in grades, reclusive behavior, listening to metal as if it's almost an addiction, their words. They want you to, if you see a couple of these things, start looking around for pentagrams, black and red robes, decorative daggers, chalices or goblets, black candles, a diary with a black cover, which they say is their book of shadows, a satanic Bible or a copy of the satanic rituals, and some kind of altar. They suggest if you find any of these things, call 911. Don't do that. Please don't do that. Please do not pin you calling emergency services on me. Then the last level is joining. This is where people start getting involved with quote-unquote violent crime, and this is where they're going to really turn heavily against their families because they want to destroy all the goodness in humanity. The dabblers are what they always seem to peg out as the most dangerous, because if you were theoretically going to join a satanic cult, most cults have unified thoughts and actions, so there is some sense of you could possibly find out what they're planning to do beforehand, or at least you can track their patterns, whereas the dabblers, quote-unquote, are kind of more out on their own, so they can act more erratically, since they don't have this group to kind of keep them in check and tell them what they do and do not want. Again in 1990, because 1990 was kind of the height of the satanic panic, so there's a lot of content here, is exposing the satanic web. Again, this is kind of a mix of a sermon and interviews. It's hosted by David Rover. He claims there are 40,000 Satanists and 100,000 occultists. I'm leaving that status just for America, but he didn't really give any way to validate. One of the people they're interviewing is Vicky Caldwell, who is from the sheriff's office in Putnam County, Florida. She laments that teachers don't seem to think that there's any kind of satanic or cult activities going on, because again, using these interchangeably. She tells a story about how 6 months ago they found 7 or 8 large dogs with their heads cut off hung in a circle in the woods. Again, and I can say this until I'm blue in the face, no self-respecting Satanist supports animal torture. Don't even know a single neo-pagan who does. They also put out a stat saying 85% of teens in Europe and 40% of teens in the US are exposed to hardcore Satanism. They don't really define hardcore Satanism, so it's kind of hard to figure out how they got that stat. They also stick very heavily to the everything is reversed. Evil is good, good is evil. And that seems to be a constant misnomer with Satanism of it's the reverse of Christianity, which there are some parts that strays very heavily, but it's not a good is bad, bad is good thing. Understanding the difference between any religion is a lot more nuanced and harder to fit into a soundbite. They say that it takes, for somebody to really get hardcore into drugs, it can take anywhere from 3 to 6 months. They say with a cult and Satanism and all of that, it only takes 1 month. They also, again, bring forth the baby farming thing, saying most women leave Satanism because they're sick of giving up their children. And to really show how much the lines blur, they talk to a voodoo practitioner who goes by the name Chicken Man, that's all he's ever cited as, in New Orleans. He says he uses chickens and snakes for healing and not hurting people. He says he essentially blesses seeds and gives them to teenagers so they can keep it around in their pocket. Apparently those seeds in their pocket are meant to keep them off drugs. I'm not saying there's any validity to that, but it's a nice idea, and I think most people of most religions want to keep people off drugs. They see how bad they can be. But again, they kind of use the talking point of even if you're doing good things with manipulating energy or magic or something like that, it's evil no matter what, because you shouldn't have access to or be messing with those forces, even if you're trying to help people out. They repeat a whole lot of the same talking points, but sometimes this one, towards the end, starts coming down as downright paranoia, because they talk about satanic blackmail and how some people have gotten in due to that. So they hold explicit photos of the person that they'll release if they don't keep following. They involve them of a sacrifice of an animal or a human, so they're as culpable in a crime as the person running the satanic cult. Or self-mutilation, where they offer blood. I believe that's supposed to have, in their minds, some kind of binding ability. They also talk about how Halloween costumes have started getting banned because culture is getting more and more violent. So a school in Arlington decided to change that, and instead of people doing Halloween costumes, they're doing more fall decorations and kids dress up as their favorite book character. And the reason I say this starts coming off as a bit paranoid is Al Rover comes in, he's some relation to our host, and he was dropping his kid off at school. And he sees a group of kids dressed in black and says, he immediately thought to himself, there's no reason for that. And then he kept watching them day after day, and eventually when he drove by, there were 2 of them fighting, which for some reason translates into occult witchcraft Satanism. People dress in black, it's high school. I don't know if my area is abnormal, but we had fights constantly. It was like, maybe they're wearing black because it's slimming, maybe it was cold out, who knows? It's a little weird to just look at a group of people that just also happen to be wearing the same color and go, oh, that's clearly wrong. We move on to the games children play, also in 1990. This one is almost blow for blow the one we saw in the 80s with Deception of the Generation. The only major difference or update I feel is even remotely noteworthy is they say now kids are getting 7 hours of TV and 2 to 3 hours of video game day. Doesn't seem quite right. They also claim 125 deaths have been linked to Dungeons & Dragons. Finally moving on to 1991 with Pagan Invasion, Halloween Trick or Treat. And Halloween becomes a more popularized thing to go after now. It just seemed to really hit home in the 90s. They talk about haunted houses, horror movies, graveyards, Ouija boards, seances all being kind of a staple of Halloween. They also talk about how it's really getting pushed in schools. They say that public schools put more effort in Halloween than any other holiday, including Christmas. Well, that's kind of skewed stat because you gotta think, Easter, kids are on break. Christmas, kids are on break. So the school isn't going to see them a whole lot of time when it's seasonally appropriate to be talking about those things. Whereas Halloween isn't a time off. So yeah, we would see more of that holiday than the others. It just doesn't seem like a good stat or a good fact to bring in. They also say horror movies account for about 20% of revenue of films overall. Reminder, this is 91, so we're coming out of the big 80s horror boom. Again, as I've said a million times on this channel, horror's always been oversaturated. It's always been, even if we're not in a boom, it's still very hard to go and not be able to find a new horror film. So that stat might not be too far off. They say horror and porn are the biggest ones. They talk about the boom in the home video market, which again, 91, perfect time, they're absolutely right. They talk about the film rating system and how the average age of a horror viewer is about 15, where most of these movies are rated R. I remember when I was younger, the rating system was enforced more. You had to show ID more often, but that doesn't mean the older brother or parent didn't run it for him anyway. So that's not anything new or different. It's just we have different technology now. It's not the kid going into the theater and trying to get in. It's the kid trying to get the video off of somebody, which this continues today with the internet and piracy, and things are exchanged a lot easier across streams, especially if you're talking about adult entertainment, which they referenced earlier is still big business, and that's huge for the internet. They get into how Halloween is a lot of leftovers from pagan religions. The problem is, so is Christmas. The celebration itself isn't pagan, but they change time periods to suit things because Christmas is not around Christ's birth. Most biblical scholars seem to believe that, but the whole bringing in the tree, decorating it, that has its roots heavily in paganism. And I haven't addressed this before, but we've had this constant Satanists are everywhere party line in the First Family of Satanism and in Satanic. That was taken as a positive of saying, like, look at these members of society that are incredibly productive and well respected that follow Satanism. It's not just about debauchery and greed. But at the same time, when we flip the script to the other end of this, where the people that are kind of producing these things view it as they're everywhere and they'll get your children. They're everywhere and they're going to influence you and you don't even know it. And again, we get that really bad line of demarcation and that blurring because they keep interviewing witches and Wiccans, but lumping it into this whole Satanism thing. One of them, her name is Sally from Kent, says she got into Wicca through Halloween and she opened up the underworld because of that. At one point they talk to a author and he talks about looking for the signs of Satanism, and it's the pretty standard list we've seen a million times on this, except for he throws in the diaper of a small baby in the woods, and he alludes to that being part of a child sacrifice, whereas that very easily could be somebody hiked with their baby and didn't clean up the diaper out in the woods, because I take that being more pragmatic over, hey, the kid got dead. And again, we get a lot of repetition because most of this stuff is recycled from a completely different documentary in the 80s. They talk about a letter Ann Landers got from a parent that said about 80% of the 9-year-olds in her class, when she asked them to write an essay about what they wanted to do on Halloween, talked about how they wanted to kill somebody and do these terrible things. They also say carved pumpkins were supposed to represent damned souls, and anybody presenting a pumpkin was sympathetic towards Satan, which is a totally new one on me. I've never heard that one before. And today's YouTube channel spotlight is Nightmares Before Bedtime. This channel focuses heavily on true crime. She has a series called One Moment in Crime that goes over different crimes that have happened in history, and she discusses them, again, always staying sensitive to these were real people involved in something probably terrible, because that's normally what crime is. She also does a series called Into the Cold, which focuses heavily on cold case files, which, if you guys have seen me commenting around on like Nightmares Before Bedtime or Kaylee Elise's stuff. I'm a huge advocate of how much the horror community goes and looks into cold cases and tries to get them some more attention in hopes of ever getting them solved. As some of you may or may not know, traditional media tends to have kind of a leaning for what cold cases and what cases get covered heavily, and the YouTube community does not seem to have the same biases or leanings, which is absolutely wonderful to see. And Nightmares Before Bedtime is a fabulous example of this. So go check out Nightmares Before Bedtime if you haven't already. Give them a subscription. Tell them I sent you. Thank you, and I really hope you enjoy. That is all for today. Next time we will pick up with the second half of the 90s and what the Satanic Panic starts to evolve into there. Again, if you like what you're hearing, please drop a comment, like, subscribe, something along those lines. If you don't like what you're hearing, feel free to drop a comment. Let me know. Thank you.